So in this series of videos, I'm looking at the long ending of Mark and why I've changed my mind about it, why I think the verses 9 to 20 of chapter 16 are most likely original to Mark, why they are part of the original layer of compositional design of the book. In the first video, we looked at the macro structure of the entire book to try and show how the long ending proves to be integral to the main structure of the book. And today we're going to look, or at least in this video, we're going to look at just the final stage here. If these are the 6 sections of the book that we looked at in the first video, what we want to do is just pay attention today to the final stage, chapters 14 verse 1 to chapter 16, where Jesus is in Jerusalem and the plot begins to arrest him and to kill him. And we can see that this is where the long ending is. It's right here, the final story. So what we're going to do then is just take a look at the first couple of verses. We'll look at just the beginning of this section, and then we'll kind of see how it's structured. What are the main stories? What are the main parts of the chapters 14, 15, and 16? And sort of begin to show how the long ending proves to be integral just within this section alone. If you just ignore the macro structure we looked at in the first video and just look at chapters 14, 15, and 16, we're going to see that the long ending proves to be a part of what seems to be a part of the blueprints, the architectural designs, say, that were in Mark's head, or maybe in print, for all we know, in an outline form. All right, so let's look at the first few verses then of chapter 14. It's pretty straightforward that it was 2 days before the Passover and the feast of unleavened bread, the combined feast lasting a total of 8 days. And the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to do 2 things: how to arrest him, how to arrest Jesus by stealth, and how to kill him. 2 distinct things: arrest him first, and then to kill him. All right, so that's the basic introduction to the final 3 chapters. So let's look at how it plays out. You can see here, this is, it's obviously the way I've divided it, but I'm going to try to show why I have it arranged like this. These parts here are pretty straightforward. I don't think as in the macro structure, we don't have to force anything to arrive at the way this is arranged. The first thing to notice is that the opening scenes, the opening setting, is centered around Bethany. We're told that the Sanhedrin, as we just read, that there's a plot that's afoot to try and arrest and kill Jesus, and then we're told that Jesus is in Bethany, and the largest story is this story here, where Jesus is reclining for a supper in Bethany. And then we're told on the heels of that Judas creates an agreement with the Sanhedrin to carry out the plot. Now, we don't know the exact location of where the Sanhedrin is, where Judas is exactly. I mean, it could have been centered somewhere around Jerusalem. It could have been go-betweens in Bethany. We really don't know, because Bethany is on the outskirts of Jerusalem. But clearly the main location, the main setting, is this dinner in Bethany, where Jesus is anointed, and he defends the woman, saying that she has prepared him for his burial, meaning he's aware that his death is imminent. The intimation, of course, in the narrative is that he's aware of the plot that's unfolding, and he's reclining at dinner. He's not doing anything to stop it. On the contrary, he's getting ready for it. So that then is centered around Bethany, the first scene. The second scene shifts to Jerusalem. This is all focused on the Passover supper, where first of all we have the preparations for that Passover, and then at the supper, the preparations are where he sends the 2 disciples into the city to make the room ready. And then at the supper, we're told that he announces the betrayal, which has up here, the plot of Judas. And then we're told about how he inaugurates the Eucharist. So those three events all take place at the supper. And again, at the supper, he's reclining. So we can notice that he's reclining here, and then he's reclining again here. And it mentions on both occasions that he's reclining, not sitting, but reclining. And then they leave the supper and they head to the Mount of Olives, to Gethsemane. So now we have the third scene. The setting is in Gethsemane. It shifts now for the third time. And perhaps en route, he announces that the disciples will be scattered. And Peter says, no, I would never leave you. And then Jesus says, you'll deny me. So that is part of that announcement. And then Jesus goes into Gethsemane proper on the Mount of Olives. And he prays and falls to the ground. And then the final scene, Judas shows up with the soldiers and he's arrested. So let's take a look at what happens here. He's reclining, and then he falls to the earth. The Greek word is earth, istin yin in Greek. He falls to the earth. And the final thing is that he's arrested. And you'll remember, if we go back to the text itself, at the very beginning, we were told there were two things that they were trying to do. One was arrest him. That's the first thing. And the second thing, to kill him. So these are the first three parts. Part 1, Part 1, Part 2, Part 3, right? Not too complicated. 3 different scenes, one in Bethany, one centered in Bethany, one in Jerusalem, one in Gethsemane. And it leads to his arrest. And the arrest is obviously climactic. It's the arrest comes at the end, and that we know that's one of their goals, so that's a key moment. What follows then are 3 more parts. The first part is in the high priest's house. We all know what's going to happen there. There's going to be a trial, and then Jesus will be sentenced, and we're told of Peter's denials in the courtyard of the high priest's house. You'll notice, by the way, there's 3 episodes to each one of these parts. Each scene has 3 episodes. And also in the high priest's house, or rather, that's I should say that where the high priest is judging Jesus, we know that he is sitting, but Jesus is standing. And we know this because the high priest stands up and tears his garments when he believes Jesus has blasphemed. So he has been sitting, and he is literally sitting in judgment. Remember, in an ancient context, the judge would be seated, and the defendant, the accused, would be standing in front of him. So Jesus is obviously standing here, and the priests are sitting, and they're sitting in judgment of him. And then he's transferred to Pilate's palace, probably the temporary residence of Pilate. Apparently it was Herod's palace, but nonetheless, it's Pilate's. It's acting as Pilate's headquarters. And so this is a new scene, right? We've switched now from the high priest's house to the Pilate's house. And there, again, follow 3 episodes. There's the trial, the interrogation with Pilate, Pilate's attempt to release Jesus, and then the sentencing and torture of Jesus. All takes place in Pilate's residence. And again, though it doesn't state it, we know just from the cultural context that Pilate would be seated and Jesus standing in front. And then we have him transferred to Golgotha. So this was now the third. This is part 3. You can see we had one column here with 3 parts, and now we're down here with another 3 parts. And what's going to happen here is Jesus is crucified, and there's a number of incidents of him being taunted and mocked while on the cross. And there's great pains or detail to tell us that he is crucified in between two other criminals, or rather two criminals, and he is at the center. And at the very end, climactically, he yells, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, why, my God, why have you forsaken me? And he dies. And so at the end here, he dies. At the end of these three scenes. And we go back again just to remind ourselves, what was their goal? Their goal was, first of all, to arrest him, and then to kill him. So Mark's real clear about that, and so that helps us to understand how this is all arranged. And of course, as he dies, it's very important to note the flow, that whereas Jesus is standing up here before the seated judge, and again standing before the seated judge, but when you get to the final thing, he is hoisted or lifted up on the cross. In order to die by crucifixion, you have to be lifted or hoisted up. So he's been now lifted into, well, where's he lifted? He's lifted into the sky, right? You have to be lifted up into the sky in order to die by crucifixion. And again, this idea here at the end that he dies was one of their stated goals. And it's obvious that Jesus, as we go along, we aren't reading all of it, but Jesus is fully aware of this. Back in the Garden of Gethsemane, he goes out to meet Judas and the soldiers. He knows what's coming, and he has freely offered himself to die. He hasn't tried to escape, but he's willingly dying. And then the final three scenes are obviously the response. Okay, the first two parts, where you have the three scenes before his arrest, and then leading up to his arrest, and the three scenes leading up to his death. That's what the plot was for the Sanhedrin, the Jewish leadership. But in the final three scenes, we get a response to his arrest and death. And the first response is centered at the burial tomb, where Joseph requests the body and then prepares the corpse. And while he's doing this and placing the body in the tomb, the women are observing what he's doing. And so we get a clear record of the fact that he was actually buried. His corpse was buried. And then we have the second scene at the tomb, still at the tomb, except now it's a different day. It's 2 days later, in the morning after the Sabbath. So the whole scene has shifted time-wise, chronologically, but they return to the tomb. And the women have purchased spices and prepared them to freshen up the wrapping of his body. And the angel meets them and announces that Jesus has been raised from the dead. And then we get the women's response that they flee in fear. So that's those first two parts, and then the final scene, or rather the first two scenes, and then the final scene, which it leads up to his ascension, where he first appears to different disciples, and on the third appearance, he gives the Great Commission to the 11, and then he ascends and is enthroned. But let's look again at the progression. That here, his corpse is obviously lying prone, right? Here he is raised up, anastasia in Greek. Anistemi means to stand up. Now he's standing up to life, into life, but literally the Greek word means to stand up. And then he ascends and is enthroned. And you can see that this idea of his enthronement is climactic, not only because he's the Messiah, but also because we've had all of these, the whole first part, he was reclining, and then he fell to the ground, fell to the earth. And then here, Jesus is standing before the seated judges, and he is condemned to death, but in order to kill him, they have to lift him up. And then here, he's lying down in the tomb, and then he stands up, and then he is able to ascend and go all the way into heaven itself and be enthroned. Okay, so you can see how there's a sort of a theme there about sitting, reclining, and so on. All right, so now that we have all that, we can see that there's 3 parts to it. We're not trying to make a real strong argument yet, just to be clear. We're not trying to make the case that this automatically means that this part here, the third scene in the final in part 3, we're not trying to argue that alone is super convincing, that it's integral. Although we did try and show that there was a logical progression in each of these scenes as you went forward. But still, that's not really the main thing we're ultimately going to focus on. What we really want to focus on instead is we want to focus on this episode here, which is part 3, or the third scene of part 1. And then we want to go to the third scene here for part 3. And again, so far, I hope you can see, I haven't really been forcing anything. I mean, it's Mark who places so much emphasis on explaining that these are different settings, different locations, and different chronology. And so he's clustered the events based on their scene, their setting, their location. And that we saw that they move logically forward to the climactic moments, first the arrest, then his death, which the Sanhedrin was their plot. And once that's accomplished, we then get part 3, which tells us of the response to what happened, or at least an epilogue, or however you want to see it. Mark's clearly showing that this is God's response to the plot that was unleashed against Jesus. Now, we could work this one in as well, but just to save time, I'm not going to talk about that one. But yes, that is also really important. To see how it fits in as well as the third scene. And I'm just picking these 2 because they're the ones that are the most relevant. You can see they run parallel to one another. All of these do. And it's worth looking at what happens, between these parts. For example, up here, Jesus is anointed in Bethany, and he says he was anointed for his burial. And you can see over here is the actual burial. And of course, there's other things. Her flask was broken in order for the ointment to be poured out. And here, the high priest will tear his garments in order to when he condemns Jesus and so on. So there's things to do, some other work to do, but we're just going to focus on these 2 boxes here: the third scene in part 1 and part 3. And so let's just look at them real quick in the text, and then we'll come back, and then we'll look at them a little bit more. All right, so let's look then at this part here. The first thing we have is that the disciples, as they head toward the Mount of Olives, along the way, Jesus says they will be scattered. He predicts, according to the prophecy from Zechariah, that the sheep will be scattered. And then he goes into Gethsemane and he prays. He separates from the other disciples, and he fell on the ground and he prayed. Then, of course, he prays to his Father that if it's possible, that this cup would be removed. Remove this cup from me. And of course, it's the cup of death. He knows what he's about to face, and he's praying that he not have to face it, but he adds immediately, not what I will, but what you will. He is willing to drink the cup of death. And then it says he came and he found the disciples sleeping, and he rebukes them for sleeping. And then he again went away and he prayed, and a second time he came. Second time he came, and they were still sleeping, and he rebukes them for sleeping, and he went away and he came the third time. Notice that, the third time he comes. So it's an enumerated set of 3 comings by Jesus to the disciples. And then while he's talking to them, he says that it's my betrayer is at hand, and rise, let us go, because he knows it's time to go meet Judas and prepare for his death. And Judas comes, and one of the disciples drew his sword, and he struck the servant of the high priest, and he cut off his ear. All right, and then at the end of all that, it says that the disciples all abandoned Jesus and fled, so they all end up scattering. All right, so that's that story. That's, to be clear, what we did here is we just looked at this box right here, this one. That was scene 3 in part 1. Now we're going to go over here to what is the long ending and look at scene 3 for part 3. And it's Jesus appeared first. Notice it's enumerated. First to Mary Magdalene. And she goes and tells the other disciples that she's seen Jesus alive, and they wouldn't believe her. They would not believe her. And after these things, he appeared, now the second time, to 2 of them, and they go and tell the other disciples. They don't believe them. And then after that, he appeared the final time, Easter dawn, lastly afterward, he appeared to the 11, and he rebukes them for their unbelief because they haven't believed those who saw him and had already borne witness. Okay, so he comes to them 3 times in his post-resurrection appearances. And then there's the Great Commission that follows this. Go into all the world and proclaim the gospel. And as part of the Great Commission, we have a couple of things we'll highlight. One is he says if they drink any deadly poison, it will not hurt them. And he says that the disciples, the believers, will lay their hands on the sick. I take these instructions to be things that would follow for the believers. It's not saying it would happen for every believer, but these types of things would accompany the mission for the Great Commission. And the disciples would lay their hands on the sick, and they would recover. They would be healed. All right. And then the last thing, he is taken up into heaven, and he sits down at the right hand of God. And the disciples went out, and they preached everywhere. Everywhere. And the Lord worked with them. So let's look now at this sort of running parallel side by side. And you can see, I hope you can begin to see, maybe you noticed some of the things that were going on there, but take a look at them now in more charted out form. Again, this is scene 1, scene 2, scene 3 for part 1, scene 1, scene 2, scene 3 for part 2, and so on. This is just the same kind of map we had before. But let's take a look at some of the parallels that are interesting here, unique, some of them unique. First of all, the whole framework of the time in Gethsemane is that Jesus comes to the disciples, and he comes to them 3 times. He separated from them at a distance, And then he came to them. First, they were sleeping. He left. He came again. Second time, they were sleeping. He left. He came again to them 3 times. Now, what's interesting about this is the only story in the whole of the Gospel of Mark where Jesus leaves the disciples and then comes in sequence like this 3 separate times to them. Okay, there's no other story like this until you get to that story in Gethsemane. But when you come to the long ending over here, we see that it too is built around 3 appearances. So this is the only other story in the gospel that's like this, where Jesus appeared first, notice it's enumerated, first, to Mary. And then obviously Jesus does not go with Mary to when she goes and bears witness to the other disciples. He is not with her. He has left her, and she has gone, or at least she has left him anyway, and she has gone to say that he is alive. And then he comes a second time, only now it's to 2 different people in a totally different location. The 2 disciples who have left the city are out in the countryside around Jerusalem, and he appears to them. And they go back in and tell the disciples, and they don't believe. And then he appears the 3rd time. And again, he didn't go with those 2 disciples. They just went into the city and said he was alive. So there's 3 appearances in part 1 over here in scene 3, and then there are 3 appearances over here. And the whole structure is that he is appearing to the disciples, and they're derelict. In the first part, in the Gethsemane, they're derelict by virtue of sleeping and not being watchful. But when you come to the final scene, they're derelict in their unbelief. They don't believe. So that's one thing, and that's not just a small thing, because the whole narrative structure is built around these in Gethsemane and in the long ending. In the post-resurrection appearances are built around those 3 separate comings or appearances. All right, now a couple other little details. One is that he falls to the ground here in Gethsemane. He falls literally to the earth. Eastin, for those of you who can read Greek, maybe this is helpful. Eastin yin, to the earth. And then over here in in scene 3, it says he ascends to heaven. Istus uranos. He ascends to heaven. And you can see right away 2 very different experiences for him. Falling to the earth in agony versus ascending triumphantly in victory. And then, and of course there's no other place where he falls to the ground or ascends to heaven, although here in this middle part I did emphasize that he was lifted up. Here, similar, but that's lifted up on earth. Here, he's lifted up, and he's in between 2 others. Remember when James and John asked him if they could be seated on a throne, one on his right hand, one on his left hand. Well, these 2 criminals are on his right hand and his left hand, and he's in the middle. You can see how Mark is painting his cross as a kind of pre-enthronement. All right, then another little detail. We'll just cover a couple more. One is that the disciple takes his sword and strikes off the ear of the high priest's servant. Then a rather inglorious moment for the disciples who are about to go out into the world and proclaim the good news. He's taking a sword and cutting off, trying to decapitate somebody, but actually removes their ear, amputates their ear. And here, in the final story, in the Great Commission, Jesus says, not that your hands aren't going to take a sword and slice someone's ear off. The disciples, the believers, will lay their hands on the sick, and they will heal them. And you can see those are 2 very different roles for the disciples. Opposite things. There's a certain poignancy to them being the opposite. And then we have this little nugget, that we have the prayer in the garden, remove this cup. Jesus would rather not drink the cup of death, but he's willing to do it. And he goes along with the Father's will, and he takes the cup and he drinks the cup of death. And then he tells the disciples in the Great Commission that some of the believers will take up a drink, in Greek thanasimon, a mortal drink, a poisonous drink, a fatal drink. It could be, it seems that the context would more likely be a type of persecution or assassination or something, but maybe not. But that's what it seems to me to imply. But if not, if you don't think that way, that's fine. The point is the drink is poisonous, but the Greek is thanasimon, which means a fatal drink, a mortal drink, the kind of drink that would kill you. It's a cup of death. And he says, you will drink it, but it will not kill you, because Jesus is going to help their mission to succeed. He will supernaturally make sure that their mission does not fail, but is fulfilled. All right, and you can see the opposite, that he took the cup of death and drank it, and it killed him. But he promises to believers that they will take up mortal drink, a cup of death, and they will not die in order for the mission to be fulfilled, now that he has died. Now, he's not saying no Christian will ever die or die by persecution, but he's assuring them that there will be times that they will drink something poisonous and won't die. And there's, of course, a famous story from Papias about Barsabbas, who's mentioned in Acts, that he took drank something poisonous and didn't die. All right, and then the last thing, which is this prediction. It's a major part of the story over here. The disciples will scatter, and sure enough, they abandon Jesus. The Greek is to abandon, aphikan, I think is how it reads there. And then, anyways, I think it's that word. And then they scatter. So they abandon Jesus, and then they scatter. But here at the end, with great confidence, the disciples go forth on their mission, and the Greek says everywhere. Is it pandakou? But they go everywhere. Okay, they're going to go throughout the world, go into all the world. So they're scattered, but now they're not scattered in fear. They're not abandoning Jesus. They're going confidently on their mission to proclaim the gospel. And far from abandoning him, Jesus, we're told, is working with them. Syn. In Greek, he's working synergeo, alongside them or together with them. So he's not abandoned. He's not abandoned by them, and he hasn't abandoned them. He's working along with them. So you can see there's just a number of details here that are the main focus of this third scene in part 1. And then when you get to the third scene in part 3, the major focus of the story and the key details seem to be obviously answering this scene over here that is centered in Gethsemane. All right, and it's probably not an accident. This is on a mountain. They have gone up a mountain, and this is about the ascension. Anyway, so there you have it. This would be more the key evidence, I think, to show that the long ending proves to be integral to the final stage of the book. In the way it's arranged, its natural arrangement. Again, I think this here is just the natural arrangement into these 9 scenes and the different settings, and the movement progressing to the arrest here, and then to his death here, and then the answer of God, Jesus' resurrection, ascension, and enthronement here at the end. I think that's just the natural way to read it, but it turns out that if you read it that way, that these two blocks are answering to one another. All right, so that's the main end to the video. All right, the third video will be concerning the style, questions of style, the literary style, and then the fourth video will turn to the external evidence and look at the manuscripts and so on. I hope this was helpful. Look forward to your comments and critique in the comment section.